All right. Is this it? Are we on? Dude, I don't know what's going on.
Oh yeah.
Success!
All right, what's up, Caleb? Hey, Caleb, if you're watching, can you let us know, are we okay? Can you hear us okay? Hello.
Yay!
Hey, King and Queen. Bird Worldist, what up, Bird Worldist?
We made it!
Yo, this is our first time streaming on YouTube. And I don't know what the fuck we were doing right now.
It was asking us for encoding software, and it was just a hot mess.
Kevin Atkins, finally. Yo, for real.
And then after like a couple clicks, we've somehow found the Hangouts.
Yeah.
Which I guess is going away now, but that's fine.
I can hear you just fine, says Caleb. What's up, everyone? So let's, should we wait a few minutes, right, to start?
Yeah. Besides our YouTube is complicated. There's just so much.
By the way, for those tuning in who have never heard of us, Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective, and we're dedicated to exposing and fighting imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the content that we create is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean people. There's no, foreign white experts here. It's us as a people speaking for ourselves, to uplift our people.
Yeah. And we started 2 years ago on Indigenous Peoples Day, October 12th. Became a party for a cool minute, then, had to restructure, and we're back to our original formation, which was Mediasite, which obviously is, part of people's propaganda, popular propaganda. And so that's really what we see ourselves in our place, especially as, first world Latinx people who have grown up in the belly of the beast, and being able to manage, English and Spanish, especially, and of course, as much as we can, any other places. It's more likely that you'll have English news sources on the rest of the world than in any other language, which obviously makes them tainted and skewed a lot of ways. But it also means that we have access to kinds of information that a lot of people don't. And obviously, it's our revolutionary duty to share that information as much as possible. And today we're in full celebration mode. It's, I was bumping like Nicaragua, Nicaraguita all morning, even though whatever Carlos Mejia Godoy is on some next level shit currently. But a lot of his music and the consignas, which were emblematic of the victory of the Sandinistas in 1979. It's important to also highlight those cultural aspects, that music, a lot of that the Sandinistas created and the people created, importantly. It's been a great day. It's also Friday, so happy Friday, everyone.
Yeah, happy Friday. Everyone's getting out for work, chilling. And shout out to Caleb. He said he's tweeting this. Anyway, this is our first live on YouTube. So we're trying this out, but it's good that we're trying to help build leftist communist YouTube culture, because unfortunately on YouTube, the right wing, both Latin American and in the US, have become so strong with YouTube and propaganda. And it's like, we got to compete. We have to create something of our own instead of just complaining about not having anything that represents us, represents our ideas. And so, thanks for everyone who's supporting. It's going to be it's our first stream, so it's going to be obviously less people than a normal stream, but maybe it'll be a cool discussion. But what do y'all, maybe you could type in the chat, what do you think about, what are your thoughts about the Sandinistas, about Nicaragua? Today is the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. And not a lot of people know about a lot of the accomplishments that they've done, and which Ofelia has been doing a lot of good research on that. And we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. But what do y'all think about the Sandinistas?
And we'll also, while folks gather their thoughts, go into, we don't want it to be like a lecture of any kind. We're just going to go into some background about Nicaragua. and then also some more of the 21st century history, especially with 2018, 2019, and the resurgence of right-wing fascist protests, basically, that happened in the country under the guise of student protests or health protests or feminist protests. And we'll discuss a little bit about how they kind of couch themselves in this type of language. And it also are, what's the word? They're also characterized as such in Western media for very specific regime change tactics. And they're tried and true strategies that work. So Ramiro will kick it off with a little bit of background.
Cool. And if you can, again, just before we start, if y'all could, thanks again, Caleb, for tweeting and sharing it. And he said, I like the Sandinistas a lot. Big increases in GDP, poverty reduction, Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. Exactly. That's the slogan right now in Nicaragua. And so basically, you know, just to give an overview of like some of the important historical context, because the thing is, like, there's no history, like whenever we see a lot of the coverage about Nicaragua in the mainstream media, most of the time it comes from this very decontextualized perspective about, you know, what is happening recently, right, with the protests. And so the dichotomy that's been set up in mainstream media is like evil tyrannical government bad, you know, or Ortega bad, Sandinistas bad. And the media has portrayed them as kind of like the staunch conservatives, right? Whereas they paint the opposition, or right-wing, the Contras. I don't even try to call them opposition. I just call them Contras, counter-revolutionaries in Spanish. You know, and they are portrayed as these like pro-democracy, cool, hip, young students who are like fighting for democracy. And so the information that we're about to get into now flips that dichotomy and shows you how that frame that we're given by mainstream media is totally decontextualized, because the government that's in place now, the Sandinista government, is actually the most radical in the country's history when you see what has happened, you know, throughout the past 100 years. Sorry, let me take out my gum because I feel I'm like, so, you know, we could, obviously there's hundreds of years of history that we can get into, but for purposes of brevity and just being able to move along faster, we're going to kind of give an overview of the early years and focus more on the latter stuff, the Cliff Notes version. And so basically Nicaragua, like every other Latin American country, except for Brazil, was colonized by Spain, right? It was a Spanish colony. The areas of modern day Nicaragua had the indigenous Chibcha people who were an admixture of you know, South American and Central American civilizations, Maya, Lenca. And, you know, obviously modern day Nicaragua was colonized and by the Spanish Empire. And then eventually it formed part of the United Federation of Central America, the Central American Federation, which was basically, you know, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. Those 5 countries were part of the I think it was called the Viceroyalty of Guatemala, or Captaincy General, one of those weird ass like Spanish government names. And so Nicaragua, one of the most important historical aspects about Nicaragua is its geopolitical location has always been very important in its history. So for example, you know, when the Spanish were controlling Nicaragua, they actually didn't really know how to really utilize the resources well. The British had been eyeing Nicaragua for a long time because it was able to access both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And so the British controlled actually the whole coastline of Nicaragua in what's called La Mezquitia. And the reason why that's relevant to what's going on with the Sandinistas today is because the British NGOs that accuse the Ortega government of being like a dictator say that he oppresses indigenous people in this area that's like has a lot of money coming in from the UK. And then they wanted to use, in the mid 1800s, Nicaragua as a canal to transport also drugs going toward China during the mid-1800s during the Opium Wars. And so leading up to basically the late 1800s, even though there was so-called independence, Nicaragua had always been controlled by a lot of English companies and a lot of increasingly US companies that were vying for that geographic location. And so, there's no natural resources there specifically that are valuable, although they do produce bananas, coffee, and other things. The most important thing is the trade route, right? And so into the 1900s, in the early 1900s, it was basically like just a giant factory and plantation for the United States. The U.S. invaded Nicaragua, I think, over 12 times. I don't have the exact year. I think it's we wrote them down actually. They invaded Nicaragua at least 10 times until 1934 during the whole early 20th century. And the reason why they were invading Nicaragua during that time period was because there was a lot of revolutionary organizing taking place. And also, more specifically, there was one guy, Augusto Cesar Sandino, who was part indigenous Nicaraguan, anti-imperialist, leftist nationalist, who was also a guerrilla fighter. And he directly would come into combat with the U.S. Marines, with the Nicaraguan National Guard, because he believed that Nicaragua should be controlled by the Nicaraguan people and not, the U.S. government, not the British.
And just to add one point, this was the case for almost all of Central America. Like, this was the case of Guatemala, this was the case of Honduras, with El Salvador, etc. Right? Like, that's why they were called, like, literally that company, the Banana Republic,
right,
is named after, which is really
old ass white people shop.
Well, which is really like disgusting, and a glorification of this incredible violence against Black and Indigenous people in the Americas, right? Like, they were the banana plantations, also South America, Ecuador, like so many other places, right? But I think especially Central America like has this like deep rooted history of being called the Banana Republics. And that exactly, this was the case and continues to be the case for a lot of semi-feudal places in Central America that, and parts of, and obviously most of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Right. And Caleb said, Major Marine Corps General Smedley Butler talks about U.S. Marines being in Nicaragua in his book, War is Iraqi. I actually haven't read that book, but we'll definitely check it out. Bird Worlder said, Iran Contra is major. The Iran Contra crew are all over the Trump admin. That's a really good point. And we're going to get to that in a bit, actually, once we go into like the more recent. Let me speed it up. Sorry, I'm fucking, whenever, Ofelia always makes fun of me because we'll be having a conversation. And I'm always like, and she's like, yo, hurry up. And I'm from New York and she's from LA. But we're like the opposite. She has like the New York.
I'll like make your point.
Like, yo, hurry up, hurry up, dude. You're taking mad long. But
no, but like Caleb was mentioning, one of the hey, salut, hello from France. Hey, welcome.
What's up?
From East LA adjacent, where we're broadcasting. One of the huge things that's known about Sandino is that he used to sneak into U.S. Marine bases, and all around like was this communist guerrilla, like badass, and was just like a character in and of itself. He had a lot of personality, so it's cool if you want to look into him. And I always think there should be a comic book written about him, and maybe someday I'll learn how to make comics to make one about him, because that would be awesome. You want to keep?
Yeah. So Sandino, and he was connected. He had two major people, right? So his two major allies, Sandino, one of them was Faroundo Martí in El Salvador, and Faroundo Martí was the founder of the Communist Party of El Salvador, one of the first communist parties in the Americas, and they originally was called the Communist Party of Central America. And what they wanted to do is they were inspired by Stalin actually and the Soviet Union, and they wanted to unite Central America to revive the goal of uniting Central America again as one country, but under a socialist. And actually, it was interesting because they kind of had a remix of the Soviet model. They wanted it to be like a Soviet Union of different like peasant farms and stuff like that. And so basically into the 1930s, you know, Sandino, Farondo Martí, and Froilan Turcios, who was a Honduran communist and a journalist, they wanted to, you know, reunite Central America, and they launched a lot of revolutionary wars against the U.S. Marines and the National Guard. And unfortunately, I think it was by 1932, Sandino was assassinated, he was killed. And a lot of his ideas and visions and his, like, you know, his actual tactical experience against the reactionary people, that inspired a lot of leftists in Nicaragua. And after Sandino died, and around that time period as well, there was the Somoza family dynasty, Anastasio Somoza de Baile. And basically, it was a family dynasty that ruled Nicaragua from the early 20th century.
He was the last Somoza, right? He was the Somoza that the Sandinistas kicked the fuck out of the country, basically.
Right. And so...
But, you know, his father, grandfather, right? They had all, you know, literally a line of succession for 40 plus years.
Yeah.
With the backing and support of the U.S. And one of the most famous quotes, right, of the beloved Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Oh yeah,
you know, FDR, which is whatever. We're not gonna get into that.
He said, what is it? He said, he's about Somoza.
Yeah.
He was like, oh, he may be a son of a B, but he's our son of a B. And FDR actually played a big role in financing the right-wing dictatorship in Nicaragua, which is why when you talk to, like, in the US, FDR is perceived as like a progressive. But when you talk to people in Central America who experienced some of the most violent periods with the government backed by FDR, you know, they have a totally different concept, because that was also around the time when FDR was funding, you know, death squads against the United Fruit Company worker unions in Central America. But basically from the 1930s into, you know, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even the 70s, the Somoza family basically ruled Nicaragua as a family business. You know, it was a handful of mainly white families who owned slaves, who were connected to...
And the important thing to remember about Latin America is when we say white, you know, we don't mean like all of these people spoke Spanish and, you know, had Spanish last names or whatever it was. But when we employ that racial term in the context of Latin America, we're talking about the descendants of the Spanish, right? Like, which were the criollos, which are still called the criollos in Latin America, which is a different meaning than Creole in the US. But to that, we mean, right, the descendants of like the colonial era, which subsequently became the ruling class in Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they ran the country. You know, that was the status quo. Objectively speaking, for the majority of Nicaragua's history, it was been ruled by wealthy white right-wing families connected to the U.S. That is the establishment. To have, you know, a so-called, like they used to call Daniel Ortega like an Indio, right? Which is, we know in Latin America is like a derogatory anti-indigenous kind of thing. But to have a government of Black indigenous people, mestizos, running the country in a leftist direction now, that's very radical compared to the overall history of the country. And so basically, moving into the 50s and the 60s, you know, you had two major events that influenced revolutionaries in Nicaragua. The first one was the the Cuban Revolution and the Algerian Revolution, right? And so you had obviously in Cuba Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and everyone else who fought against Batista. Batista was an ally of the Somoza family, and actually Batista had a lot of troops, death squads based in Nicaragua that, you know, would attack the guerrillas in Cuba from the south, because Nicaragua, if you go to the Caribbean Sea, it takes you up to southern Cuba. And so basically you had, you know, the Somozas who were killing people in the 60s. And so inspired by the Cuban and Algerian revolutions, there was the formation of the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional that, interestingly enough, was founded on the same day.
Oh, also in Honduras, though.
Yeah, and in Honduras, and on the same day of the revolution, that when they actually won, you know what I'm saying, on July 19th. And so it was founded by Carlos Fonseca, he was a librarian, and I think he was also a professor. And he was really inspired by the Cuban Revolution, the Algerian Revolution, and also Tomás Borges, who was a Marxist-Leninist and admired the Soviet Union as well. So they created the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional in the 60s. And eventually, you know, they were able to build a base of resistance against the Somoza family.
And I mean, for decades, like literally, yeah, for like over a decade, right? I mean, Fonseca actually died before 1979, a few years, right? Maybe 2-3 years before. And what was very distinct about the Sandinistas is they worked within the base of the churches, and they organized through like what do they call it? Kind of liberation theology, but still very Marxist, Leninist, and leftist. But it was just like their tactics, right? They didn't want to ostracize folks who were religious, because 90% of the country was extremely religious. And even if you look at some of the culture, the music, and like Caleb mentioned, right, even the slogan of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua today is Soberana, Cristiana,
Solidaria,
y Solidaria. So you know, that was like one of their key organizing tactics and points that led them to a successful revolution and taking of power in 1979.
And funny anecdote, in a lot of the churches where they used to have meetings to organize the Frente, they had these chalkboards where, like, on one side it was like hymns and verses from the Bible, and on the other side it was like like maps, like where to attack next, where to organize, and it was like Marxist concepts. It was like capital, and they would flip it whenever the Somoza police would come, and then they would start praying and like pretend they were mass, and then when the police left, they would like go back to doing the meetings.
Which is smart as fuck. So basically, so there's like continuous conflict in the country from basically since the foundation of the Sandinistas until 1979. Obviously, there's retreats, advances. You know, you can go into the whole history of the war, which I'm not too up on, but 1979, they controlled most of the country. Somoza flees maybe the 17th or the 16th of something of July, and guess where he went? He went to Miami, where they all go.
Of course, fucking Miami.
Where their summer homes are in Miami, the hotbed of like Latin American and Caribbean reactionary movements and the ruling class, essentially. And July 19th was when they basically entered Managua and raised the Sandinista flag. And those iconic images you see in the big plazas, in front of the churches, on the tanks, with the flags everywhere. And it was just like a watershed moment. And then what happens after that? Reagan comes along.
Fucking Reagan. One thing before we get into Reagan that I think is interesting to mention as well is that what was different about the Sandinistas from a lot of guerrilla movements at the time was that actually a lot of their battles were in the urban areas. So they were in like smaller cities like León, Matagalpa, and they employed urban guerrilla warfare. There was some fighting obviously in the countryside, but in terms of the really decisive battles like León and Matagalpa and Masaya, like all those battles were in kind of like, think of it in like in the US, right? If it was like Baltimore, kind of like medium-sized cities, right? And a lot of the fighting took place there. So that was something that was interesting about them that differentiated it from other groups at the time. So Reagan.
So Reagan comes along, and I mean, we kind of all know that story, but he takes office in 81, 2 years later, and develops the Contras strategy, the Contrarrevolucionarios, or Contras for short, which were trained in Honduras. And, you know, they were basically a death squad. You know, they came in and just rampantly destroyed everything the Sandinistas had worked so hard to construct, even in those short couple years, right? And they were just incredibly violent, like widespread, like rape. They would burn infrastructure, housing. You know, there was no rhyme or reason to the things that they did. And a lot of them were trained and funded by like Israel, the US,
yep.
The Honduran military, which was also really right wing at the time, still is.
Yeah.
What else? And of course, while this is happening, everything is being blamed on the Sandinistas, right? Like the violence, the death toll. It was a different time also in the 80s. But nonetheless, more and more evidence more and more resounding evidence starts to appear that the Contras are being funded by the US, that, you know, Reagan didn't have permission to fund the Contras from Congress. Not that they ever really get permission to fund these death squads, but they do it anyway. And that was one of like a key moment for political movements in the US to rally behind the Sandinistas and against the Contras, and actually created a lot of support for the Sandinistas in the US, which was, you know, something I think rare, and that didn't really happen.
Caleb said, I had no idea who Oliver North was until I was in college. Too recent to be history, too old to be current events. Interesting. I actually don't really know much about that, to be honest.
And some facts on the Contras, there was like over 1,000 attacks that were planned and coordinated by them, you know, bombing public plazas, bombing churches. And here's the funny thing, you're hearing all of these things, and that's exactly what the student protests were doing, you know, this April and last year, and destroying public infrastructure, blocking roads, raping women, murdering police officers, and like a litany of other things, which is, Ramiro's right, you know, they're more aptly described as Contras than anything else, you know. And on top of just, you know, the fucking widespread violence and fear that they spread in the country, they were also trafficking cocaine. And that was like,
yeah,
enormous. And what Reagan did is he would take basically cutbacks, is that what they call them? Cutbacks from the cartels to fund the Contras.
Yeah, that was part of the whole Iran-Contra scandal, right? It was like at the time there you had the Iran-Iraq war. And to be honest, I don't really know too much about the Iran-Iraq war, but basically what we know is that he made some backdoor deal, weapons deal with Iran, and that money was used to help fund the Contras in Central America, who also conveniently were shipping in drugs from South America, from Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, and other countries, and were bringing it to the inner cities of the United States. And there's a really good journalist I would suggest everyone take a look at, Gary Webb, who used to be a reporter. I think he was with the Mercury News. I forget which newspaper he used to write for, but basically he was a US journalist who exposed a lot of the CIA involvement in the crack cocaine trade, which involved the Contras, you know, the drug runners. And he was mysteriously, you know, just killed himself, like out of nowhere. So I found that to be really weird that he committed suicide.
So because Reagan didn't have authority to fund the Contras, because they were, it was just known about the human rights abuses, right? Even at that time in Congress in the 80s in the US, he had to find illicit funds, basically, or, you know, maneuver some types of deals, right, to get money, guns, whatever strategy to the Contras. And that's why that happened. Because at that time, after the Iranian Revolution, right, when the US is like condemning Iran and upholding the Shah, and next thing you know, they're having arms deals with them, which to us is like, we're obviously supportive of Iran, but, you know, in the eyes of the US and the imperial US, it was also hypocritical. Right. How could they support a country like Iran? But then it's like, okay, well, they were strategic. They were looking for money, and that's how they got it. And then same thing with the cartels. That actually led to the development and the growth of most of the cartels in Latin America, which also, you know, becomes the primary driver for a lot of the widespread violence experience in Honduras and Mexico, in et cetera, all over Latin America and the Caribbean. So then,
Bird Worldist made a really good comment. Bird Worldist said, we were talking about Gary Webb, suicide with 3 shots behind the head. Exactly. That's fucking sus. Like, right. How do you shoot yourself? That was sus. And then the other point they made was same as in Hong Kong student protests. And it's the same model, pro democracy protests.
That,
right?
But that seems to be the the more recent pattern with regime change on behalf of the U.S. It's like youth student protests, and that's been the case in Venezuela. That's the case in Nicaragua. Hong Kong, China. So then fast forward, right? The Contras get tons of money. They turn the country upside down. And by 1990, the Sandinistas lost state power. They were forced into an election, essentially, and in which there were myriad reports of fraud and corruption and all these things with the election itself. And Nicaragua actually ends up electing its first woman as the head of state. But of course, it was all performative, right? Because she was super neoliberal and like right wing and totally pro-capitalist. And in the years between 1990 and 2007, there's an immediate rollback of all the social programs, economic programs, literacy programs, education programs, health programs, etc., that the Sandinistas have worked so hard to build and develop, even under the constant siege of the Contras, and on top of that, obviously, economic maneuvers against the country, which continue to this day. So it's just, another repetition of history. I
think another thing that's important to add on that point is, the fact that Nicaragua is so important because it's right in the heart of the drug trade, especially in the 80s, right? You had out of nowhere, like within a matter of months, the amount of crack cocaine that was being flooded into like South LA and Harlem, it went up, like skyrocketed overnight. And also at that time period, what's important to note is that was when this whole strategy of like pro-democracy imperialism really started. Because look at the context, right? You have them trying to do the same thing in Afghanistan with the Taliban. And then eventually, they started replicating that model, right? Of like the pro-democracy opposition. And by 1990, when, power was given up to the opposition, the Sandinistas were in a very weak position because the Soviet Union was dismantled. I don't like to say collapse, because when people say collapse, it makes it seem like it fell on its own weight because of socialism. It was forcibly dismantled. And that weakened, Cuba, Nicaragua, and so that was a concession that people had to make. So I think like when a lot of young revolutionary communists who are like, oh, like we can't reconcile with the opposition, 100%, we agree with you, but you have to understand the context and the circumstances that a lot of these decisions were made at a time of weakness. You know what I mean? The left as a whole was in a very weak position in the 90s. And so that was why the right-wing opposition, and like people were saying in the chat, the evangelicals in the 90s, they started gaining momentum. They started, like Caleb said, the evangelicals started saying, oh, the Catholics are communists, you guys are gonna fail. The evangelical churches started growing. And then eventually, I don't know if you want to get into when Ortega was reelected in 2000, what year was that? 2006, 2007?
I think it was 2006, and he came into office in 2007, I think. But in any case, at that point, people were just fucking fed up with the right-wing U.S.-backed state. They were like, we want to return, to progressive governance, to socialism, to the Sandinistas. And that's literally what happened since 2007 and every subsequent election since then. Ortega has been elected. And on top of that, they've won majorities in the National Assembly. Since then, although things were kind of quiet in Nicaragua in the past 2 years, there's been, just an uptick and a resurgence. And since they took power, there's been a lot of splinter movements from the Sandinistas, but we don't need to get into that, because that's neither here nor there, and they're full of shit. So, if you really want to look them up, we suggest also for although we ended up doing the background, although we weren't supposed to, there's like, you can check out our Decolonizing Media episode on the truth about Nicaragua. You can also check out give me a second.
Also, I like Alliance for Global Justice. Shout out to Alliance for Global Justice. I don't know if anyone from that organization is watching this, but they have some really good material on Nicaragua.
The Truth About Nicaragua, Decolonizing Media, which was an episode Ramiro did, which there's more extensive history, especially if you want to learn about William Walker, the transatlantic slave trade, and the connections it had to Nicaragua. Nicaragua protests, the new face of imperialism. And so those are two great backgrounders that we did that have way more detail and the nitty gritty of the history. If you're not familiar with it or want to refresh or whatever, like I would definitely recommend you check those out. We'll put the links in the chat. But basically since then, it's been a constant ebb and flow of, unity, struggle, unity, where, the Sandinistas have put forward tons of socioeconomic programs to help, the poorest and most destitute women, youth, indigenous folks, Afro-Nicaraguense folks. And, what we really wanted to talk about, besides, kind of going over a little bit about what happened in the past 2 years, in 2018 and 2019. And essentially the protests started in April. They seem to like April. That's also when the guarimbas started ramping up in Venezuela. April is like the student protest month, I guess, the right-winger month of preference for some reason. There must be some reason why the fucking USAID or the CIA decides that that's like the day, the US State Department, that's like their month. In any case, so what happened initially was there was some reforms being proposed to the public health system. And this wasn't because Ortega was all of a sudden like, yeah, fuck the public health system, we're just gonna roll that back. No, it was under the pressure of the IMF and the World Bank and these structural adjustments that they wanted to do, including the business sector in the country that wanted these adjustments. Obviously, people were pissed. They were like, we don't want this. And in like the same day when the protest started on a legitimate issue, right? We're not contesting that. Ortega says, okay, we're gonna pause. We're gonna have some type of dialogue and figure out what we can do about it. Mind you, he had already backed I believe the IMF off more severe reforms on top of that, right? To the public health program. And although, and it's not just Ortega, right? Although the Sandinistas and the ruling party of the FSLN put out a stop to the reforms and said, well, hey, we're going to engage in dialogues. It's more than Ortega, right? It was, they said, okay, we're going to figure this out. We need to have a discussion about it, whatever it is. And then the business sector just took wind of it. And all of a sudden, this legitimate kind of protest that happens in the street is disfigured and transformed into Ortega's literally a day later, Ortega's a dictator and he needs to be pushed. He needs to resign. Like literally from April the 18th to April the 19th. It was like an immediate flip. And if you read Alliance for Global Justice Dismissing the Truth, in which they debunk a lot of Amnesty International's bullshit report on the violation of human rights in Nicaragua, they go step by step between how people were reporting on the facts base, how people were reporting on what was going on the ground in Nicaragua. And so then it all kind of blows up from there. All of a sudden, and in a very quick and coordinated fashion, you have road closures, you have high military grade weapons that the police don't even have, right? That protesters were running around in. You have the shutdown of the National University in Managua, or both of the public universities essentially in the center of the city, that basically they serve working class people, right? It's not like the wealthy go there. But you had road closures, you had people taking over towns, you had people literally like kidnapping young people, young women, raping young women. And if you read the Dismissing the Truth report, I don't have like the line by line of all the cases, but they literally go line by line through all the cases and explain exactly what happened. And it's really violent when you read about what they did and what they continue to try and do. And all of it was, okay, get rid of Ortega and sow as much discord as we can in the country, destroy as much public infrastructure as we can in the country. And much like the guarimbas in Venezuela, they bombed maternity wards. They bombed public radio stations. Multiple people died because of the road blockages, because they couldn't get through to an ambulance. Women who were in labor died because they couldn't get to a doctor. There's just like a lot of these deaths that are deaths that happened because of these couple months of protesting were at the hands of these right-wing student protesters, and were at the hands of, and who knows how many students they were. I think that's nonsense. But we're also, a lot of them were linked to former Contras. Some of them were even linked to like MS-13 in El Salvador. So there was just like a very concerted effort from all of these reactionary elements within the country to stage a coup. And when the masses in Nicaragua saw and experienced this, many of which are still strong supporters and are Sandinistas themselves, they were like, fuck this, we're not gonna take this. And they took up arms and they defended their cities, their towns. And then eventually, obviously, the police also had to react in self-defense, right? It wasn't like Nicaragua all of a sudden started being rampantly violent. It's one of the safest countries in Central America, which, given the context, neighbors like Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras are some of the most dangerous and violent in the Western Hemisphere, right? So when you put it in that context, right, even though it doesn't have the best homicide rates or anything like that, within Latin America, within its region, it's an incredibly stable, incredibly safe country. And that means a lot when you think about the migrant crisis and thousands of people going through hundreds of kilometers, through Mexico, through Guatemala to try and get to the US. Like, what type of desperation is behind that? And there's little, if any, Nicaraguenses doing that kind of trip, because there is that type of, stability. But anyway, so these student protests come in, and all of a sudden everything you see on the news is Ortega the dictator, the Trotsky of tyranny, right? Fucking Bolton. You see all these things.
Fuck Bolton.
Yeah, you just see all these things in Western media, like completely, misconstruing. Mind you, Ortega, Rosario Murillo, and all the representatives in the National Assembly were elected overwhelmingly. The Sandinistas have 70 of the 90-something seats in the National Assembly. They also have, major positions in the government, but not all of them. There's also opposition parties, and they're small and minor, but Ortega also has overwhelming support in the country. So I think it's important to remember those things and to remember the context. Like, why is it that all of a sudden there's this resurgence of a quote-unquote student protest? And I've seen things as ludicrous as Somoza equals Ortega, which is fucking insulting when you think about it.
Caleb had a question. What do you think about Rosario Murillo's personality? What are the Trees of Life Bill of Metal? Oh, yeah.
They do those every year.
Yeah.
Well, no, but recently, I don't know if every year. The curly trees that light up and stuff like that.
And he said, "I'm so glad you guys are doing this." Thanks, Caleb. We appreciate that. And this is our first live again. But it's a cool count. We have a cool group of people who've been following us here. Rosario Murillo is a very interesting person because she combines. She's religious. She's Christian, but she also combines it with a lot of local indigenous and also African spirituality that have influenced Nicaraguan culture. And so I think she's emblematic of people who are religious, who are open-minded, and that distinction between, because again, we think a lot of times about people who are religious as all being right-wing, but in the context of Nicaragua, most of the time, if you're Catholic, you're leftist, and if you're kind of more with the spiritual indigenous,
but that's distinct from the Catholic Church, right? Because there's a lot of folks, Sandinistas, that are Catholic, that are religious,
right?
But the Catholic Church as an institution,
even
within the protests, also another important point, they were harboring fucking terrorists. They were keeping weapons in the churches. They allowed young people, young Sandinistas, to be tortured in churches. A young woman was raped in a church. There's just all of this craziness, and some of the archbishops and folks that are really high up in the church have basically condoned all of the behavior of these terrorist groups. in the past couple months and in the past 2 years, which is insane. And
another interesting thing, like the crazy thing also is the whole stuff with the canal with China.
Caleb is saying, what is the position on abortion? No, you can't get an abortion in Nicaragua, from what I understand. I do believe that it's one of the few countries that has a clauses in case of rape, incest, emergencies type of thing. But the enforcement of that stuff and the access women have to that is very limited. So even though it's a law, in practice, it doesn't happen. But at the same time, it's not like El Salvador, where women are openly persecuted if there's even a semblance or an inkling of the fact of someone thinking they had an abortion. And it's kind of like a witch hunt, because sometimes women will have miscarriages and people who want to fuck them over will say, oh, well, actually she had an abortion. That's why those really famous cases with the Salvadoran women who actually went to jail under the FMLN, which is a whole nother conversation. But I would say the FSLN like has a slightly different position in that they're not gonna necessarily prosecute anyone if they have an idea that they have an abortion, but they're not having access to safe legal abortions. So it's a point of contention, and it's a point of like, there needs to be improvement to that. And it's one of the criticisms that we have also, right? It's like ensuring that, but that also comes with like a highly religious kind of country and party.
Right, the contradictions, because it's like...
But that's been from the beginning, right? That's not something new.
Right.
It's not something that just suddenly came about, you know?
Yeah, and I think, like, me and Ofelia were just talking about this today, that a lot of young Latinos in the U.S., unfortunately, you take ultra-left positions when it comes to, like, Nicaragua or even, like, Venezuela sometimes, because, yes, it is more religious. Like, both of us are atheists, both of us are communists. We understand reality in terms of dialectical materialism. However, that being said, that does not mean that we shouldn't have critical support for a government like the Sandinistas, because,
And I also think people are uninformed. So they equate the rejection of the bourgeois capitalist state in the US and with the rejection of all states, right? So they reject, even a Sandinista progressive government, right? Like they think all states are bad, right? Because they have the lived experience of the US, but that's not always the case. It's not always clear cut like that, right? And obviously when the people have taken state power, it's a different situation, but that's the difference between, understanding things as a socialist versus like a liberal, or even as a progressive. But I think a lot of people can be pushed in that direction, but I just think like that's the train of logic that they have. And also when they see student protesters, right? Much like, the police and the military here are reactionary force to stamp out progressive movements. They think, oh, Sandinistas, police oppressing students equals bad. Right. And it's laziness also of not doing a little bit of research on like what's actually going on in the country, what's at stake in the country, what's important in the country. So I think that's part of it also. And I find that with a lot of people. They're like, but what about the students? And I'm like, what students?
Not all students are revolutionary and not all governments are reactionary.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
And it's about examining the class nature of these things, which we do, obviously. And thanks, shout out to Brian desde Peru. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're happy to have you here. Hopefully we can share some good info with y'all.
So it's difficult to get news about what's happening there in Nicaragua. That's so true. That's so true.
So in any case, so this craziness happens. There's a coordinated effort between people's militias, not paramilitaries. They weren't fuck paramilitaries. People's militias acting in self-defense against these right-wing violent student protests. And they were fucking racist. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
It's like, even if you saw, two things. It's literally like the guarimbas. Like if you've studied the guarimbas in Venezuela and you understand the nature of the guarimbas in Venezuela, it's almost the same thing in Nicaragua. So they hired people, young people, right? Like they put them out as fodder, right? Like encourage them to do all these crazy things. And even people who initially started with the protests on the healthcare stuff eventually turned away and were like, whoa,
Yeah.
like what is going on? And there's verified statements of many students who are like, I had a legitimate grievance against, you know, the state, not just the Sandinistas, right? But like the state and the Sandinistas for the reforms they were doing. And next thing you know, they're talking about threatening to rape me and all these things because I don't want to go out and destroy everything we've built. Because that's what was happening, right? They were destroying hospitals, public infrastructure, roads. They were, another thing they were doing was holding up food. So they were like holding up truck drivers from like El Salvador and Honduras, people who had nothing to do with it. And they were just like holding them up in the street, holding them hostage until the police and the military got involved, and the people's militias. The people's militias had a huge role to play in stabilizing the country again. Because who wants this? Who wants to live through that kind of thing? So I think that's important to understand the class nature of those protests, why they started over something legitimate, but obviously it was strategic, because then it was usurped, you know, by US aid, by the State Department, by the CIA, via, you know, all their in-house channels in Nicaragua. So that was like the business sector, that was like the MRS, that's like, you know, the right-wing student movement, et cetera, et cetera.
And they all get money from the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID. You have the US allocating millions of dollars annually.
4.2 million.
Yeah.
From 2014 to 2017. And even more, right? We haven't kept track of everything, but there's even more.
Yeah.
As the days go on. But I think, so that's important to understand. It's also important to understand where Nicaragua stands in terms of drug trafficking and trade, period, because they also had a plan of building a transoceanic canal with China that would rival the Panama Canal in the US, because obviously the US as the world hegemon controls all trade, but it's specifically trade that comes through freight ships in Panama, right? They get a cut of every ship that runs through there, and they basically control it, even though the Panama Canal is in the control of Panama, but only it's mostly performative and cursory, right? Like it's at the end of the day, what the US says goes.
Yeah, and it's like it presents a challenge to the US hegemony in the region, because when you have Nicaragua cooperating with China, and here's the thing, like
I'm gonna grab my computer.
And here's the thing, right? It's like a lot of things with what was going on in Nicaragua involved the use of like these ultra-left anarchists and Maoist groups, and that were against the Sandinistas. And sorry, we're turning on the fan. But you know, you have the use of these seemingly left groups in Nicaragua that were used to protest the government, and that seems to be like, for example, the opposition in Nicaragua was holding protests against the construction of the canal. However, those same groups that were protesting construction of the canal supported it when it was the US that wanted to create a canal. And so there's such a double standard.
All of a sudden, Nicaragua wanted to link up with China, and they were like, whoa. What about the environment?
Right.
You know,
all of a sudden.
Yeah. So I think we did a bad job, because we said we were going to focus on the accomplishments, and we've been just blabbing for like 50 minutes.
But it's chill. Shout out to everyone on here, by the way.
Yeah, thanks for spending your Friday night with us. Turn up.
Fuck the club. Chill with Anticonquista. Get drunk off of socialism. U.S. media often accuses Nicaragua of persecuting indigenous people, Native Americans. So true.
Yeah, I think because of the strength of, and I don't want to just say identity politics, but of reductionist politics.
Yeah.
They've been very intelligent about grabbing on to those identifiers like, you know, race, gender, when in the US, they don't give two fucks about those people. But all of a sudden, every government doing progressive things in the third world is homophobic, transphobic, anti-indigenous, anti-black. And sure, there are legitimate social issues across Latin America, even in progressive and socialist states. And I'll never forget what Fidel said. That's a production of 500 years of your fucking colonialism and imperialism, not of 60, 70 years of socialism and progressive governance. Fuck out of here. Like, that's exactly. Not where it originates. That's not to say we can't work on it. We don't have our qualms about it. Of course we do. But at the end of the day, it's a tactic the U.S. uses to manipulate, especially people of color, I would say, and progressives in the U.S. because their mind is like, you know, you just and corporate media in the U.S. that doesn't give you access to news sources that are critical and reflective of the masses and the people in those countries. They just, parrot whatever the U.S. hegemonic and imperialist line is on any given subject, right? But even with the Transoceanic Canal Nicaragua had in mind, they had tons of consultations with indigenous folks, Afro-Indigenous communities. And I think it's important to get into some of the accomplishments at this point, because that also speaks to a lot of the work the Sandinistas and that Nicaragua has done to remedy some of those things. And one of the biggest things is infrastructure. So, it's not the sexiest thing when people want to talk about communism or socialism, but that's really the bread and butter of what we want to achieve as communists and hope for as communists and socialists and revolutionaries. It's a society that cares for the needs of the majority. And Nicaragua has worked really hard to develop infrastructure in the country. That includes connecting every department with roads, which was not a thing before. And because of this, small farmers are now able to transport, their crops. They're able to trade in major cities. They're also able to connect the Caribbean region of Nicaragua, which is mostly indigenous and Afro-descendant, which was excluded from a lot of things because there was literally no way of getting there. They built a major highway there. That was one of the accomplishments we wanted to highlight. Building massive bridges in the country. And on top of that, building all types of other infrastructure within education, health, and we can go into some of those. We're just looking at our notes real quick.
Because then the reaction is going to be like, show me your stats. Ben Shapiro.
Oh, and because of the development of the road structure in Nicaragua, which it's pretty exciting because that means they were able to develop water projects, potable water. That means that rural and urban areas have increased their access to safe drinking water in most of the country, which, as we know, is one of the highest causes of communicable and transferable diseases in third world countries. So Nicaragua that's also helped, even though it's an infrastructure project, these things are all connected. It's also public health at the end of the day, to have running water, to have clean water, to have access to roads. What if there's a medical emergency? You need an ambulance, right? There's like programs in Nicaragua to help you get that type of care. So that also, helped bring in and connect more indigenous and Afro-descendant folks within Nicaragua, which is absolutely important. On top of that, we can get into some of the poverty in general, right? It's dropped since taking power. The Gini coefficient has improved, which you can explain a little bit about.
Yeah, it's like the inequality, right? The Gini coefficient measures inequality within different countries. And think of it like this, right? In 1 year, in 2016, Nicaragua's poverty rate dropped from 29.6% to 24.9%. That's a big deal for a global South developing third world country to drastically drop. And here's the thing, right? The methods have been kind of different from traditional socialist planned economies because they do allow an element of small family businesses. So the government actually provides loans, very extremely low interest and sometimes no interest loans to families to help develop their family businesses, restaurants, local industry. And they run a lot of collectives and worker co-ops in Nicaragua within a market. So it's kind of different, right? So then like you have more ultra left people who are say, oh, well, that's, revisionism or that's bourgeois because, they're doing it this way. But it's like at the same time, as Marxists, we have to understand that we have to adapt tactics to the conditions of the day. and there's certain infrastructure and businesses that needed to be developed in that way in Nicaragua, and they're doing it. And obviously, it's not perfect, but the numbers show objectively that, you know, inequality is going down, the Gini coefficient is going down, extreme poverty is going down.
Yeah, and thanks, Caleb, for subscribing. And yeah, he says a lot of parts of the USA don't even have clean water. Yeah, and even the water you have that you think may be clean probably has tons of carcinogens and things that your state allows there to be exceeding amounts in parts per million that are actually toxic to your body. So there's a lot of those things also, even within the US. And Robert joins us saying, Viva Nicaragua Libre. Thanks for joining us.
We wish we could be out there right now.
Yeah, really. Then another thing is like the celebrations, which you're obviously not going to see in Western media. They're massive.
Yeah.
You know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. There's live streams literally right now out in the street, and I can just see the LA Times or New York Times tomorrow writing like something somehow finding.
They were all forced to be there.
They were all paid to be there or something. Yeah. And then, you know, also life expectancy obviously has increased, right? We had, I think from the facts I have, is 54 in 1970, 64 in 1990, and 75 in 2015. That's high as hell.
Yeah.
That's high as hell for a country like Nicaragua.
Right. And it keeps going up, like the curves, you know, and
women live longer than men.
Right.
A lot longer.
Right.
And on women, they have a longer life expectancy, obviously because they have universal health care. They have access to health care, prenatal health care, infant care, which we know for women, a lot of women, you know, what is it? Not maternal mortality rate, like when you're pregnant, and women die from literally not having access to prenatal care, OBGYNs, doctor's visits, anything like that while they're pregnant. That's like a huge, and just a pregnancy in general, people don't really understand. It's a huge risk. It's like people have kids every day, but at the end of the day, like carrying a child is taxing to the body, and it's difficult, and you need to be under medical supervision, or try to be, right? Have comprehensive healthcare when you're trying to have a child. So that's, even though people, you know, may not know that, but that's a huge and important, having access to that. And on top of that, it says that this is from the State of World's Children by UNICEF 2015. They haven't published any of the reports. This is just kind of like the raw data, although it's from 4 years ago. And also they say women have access to contraceptives, which, even though it's a massively religious country, that's step one. Access to reproductive health, reproductive rights, and women's liberation is even having access to contraceptives. In the US, you can't even buy birth control without a prescription, which is nonsense. You know? On top of that, it's ranked as one of the most gender equal in the world by the World Economic Forum. So we're citing all these places because even you know, the bourgeois institutions recognize and acknowledge everything the Sandinista government has done, everything the Sandinistas have done, everything the people have rallied around and worked on in 12 years? 12 years of being in power in Nicaragua. On top of that, they also have a law based on the reforms, the Constitution 2014, that mandates that 50% of public positions and 50% of elected positions, right, in the National Assembly have to be women. So that means that Nicaragua also has one of the highest representation of women in their government. And I think they're like 9 or 10 in the world. Yeah. Behind like Rwanda, Cuba, obviously. On top of that, there's a very interesting fact about sex workers in Nicaragua.
Yeah, basically, I think it was 2015. In 2015, basically the government created a program where they hired sex workers, women and LGBTQ folks who had no other option but to sell their bodies because we still exist under capitalism, and you still got to do what you got to do to survive. And instead of taking the approach of criminalizing the sex workers and arresting them and beating them and killing them as happens in other countries, they actually hired them. And they created a program where sex workers were hired to mediate community issues. So when there were disputes in certain neighborhoods, they were hired to basically mediate between neighbors in a way to replace police. So that was one way that they also helped to demilitarize and create less of a police presence. And actually, a lot of the so-called paramilitary groups that Western media claim, are cracking down on protesters are the people themselves who have organized these community colectivos that come together to defend the gains of their revolution, but also to mediate themselves. Like the police, if you look at videos of police in Nicaragua, they're not carrying like huge automatic rifles as they do in like Mexico or Honduras or other countries. They have like little batons and flashlights.
They're not allowed to have guns.
Right.
Just like the Guardia Nacional Bolivariana, they're not allowed to have guns.
Exactly.
Which I don't necessarily agree with, but
yeah, because sometimes people get crazy out there.
Because I'm like,
take care of business.
No, but that's a decision they made, right? Because they know they have to play this game with the world hegemon.
Exactly.
So they don't even let that be a point of conversation or start point, right? They don't have that. In addition to that, there's also been obviously tons of development with public health, which obviously greatly benefits women as well, and rural communities, building maternity hospitals, building community clinics, ambulance programs to have people get healthcare and to get to emergency care when they need it. There's also been programs to help, to help create, to help women develop more agricultural skills, to help women also acquire the titles and deeds in both rural and urban areas to their lands, giving them and putting the deeds in the women's name, because that was like a huge issue. Because there are still Contras in Nicaragua, right? That was one of the big issues. Like they still have not left.
Right.
And obviously the ruling class is still there. So that creates all kinds of issues as well. There was in fact a case of one woman who was married to a former Contra, and he almost killed her. And then a government program was able to help her move away from him, find her own land, gave her seed money essentially to start her own farm, and gave her a cow and a goat and a chicken and all the basic things, and gave her training and classes and skills to help her develop her crop. And besides that, Nicaragua is also, in terms of the environment, twofold. They're one of the most affected by climate change, which is crazy, right? But it's like, fuck, we haven't had enough shit thrown at us. The third world is also the most affected by climate change.
Yeah.
Like, God damn it. But that being said, they're very proactive about the environment. They actually use a lot of renewable energy sources. Like 60%, according to the Nicaraguense Energy Institute in the country, are made from renewable sources. Currently versus 27% in 2006. So this is also in conjunction with the electricity program, which means everyone in the country has access to electricity. I don't know if it's all the time, it probably isn't, but at some point, everyone has access to electricity during the day to be able to, whatever they need to use for their needs. And it says 9 to 10 people, according to the Nicaraguan Central Bank, have access to quality, low-cost electricity services in the country. And that also comes with infrastructure, right? How are you going to develop electricity, light poles, generator, storage without roads? So they all build on top of each other, and they're all absolutely necessary. They're all absolutely necessary to creating a socialist society. And education also has one of the highest achieving kind of markers for Latin America and the Caribbean. There in 2006, so when Ortega and the Sandinistas came to power again, they had 700,000 K through 12 students in schools. Nicaragua is a country of about 7 million, right? And then in 2017, that number has doubled. So they're at like 1.5 million and growing, because that number is obviously 2 years dated.
That's really cool.
But what does this mean when you say a statistic like that? I think it's important to paint a picture in people's minds. That means they're recruiting, training, compensating more teachers, right? They're building classrooms. They're building schools and classrooms, including repairs. They're buying desks, they're buying supplies, they're buying chalkboards. And then on top of that, they eliminated barriers to education. So as is the situation in most of Latin America and the Caribbean, and I'm not too familiar with other, Africa or Asia, but I would imagine it's similar. You have to pay for fucking everything. You have to pay for tuition. You have to pay additional monthly fees. You have to pay for your uniform. You have to pay for your school supplies. All the things that are kind of given in public education here in the US are not a guarantee in most of the rest of the world because of neoliberalism. All of that stuff has been privatized, monetized, and if you can't pay, you're fucked. So they eliminated a lot of these arbitrary fees. So they also instituted, on top of that, a multi-pronged meal program at schools for vulnerable students. So no student is going to learn if they're hungry. No family is going to send their kid to work if they're hungry. So along with helping adults kind of accomplish and reach literacy, which was also an issue, they've created food programs at schools, which obviously follows the motto of the Black Panther Party, another great revolutionary Marxist-Leninist group that started the school lunch programs. And these programs, it's really cool because what happens is not only do they feed the students in the schools, but those crops come from the cooperatives that Ramiro mentioned. So they're all linked together.
Yep.
And not only do the farmers, small farmers, subsistence farmers have somewhere sure and regular to sell their crops, but then it impulses and ensures that, youth are healthy, they're consuming food produced in their country, which contributes to food sovereignty and sovereignty in general, because, that's a lot of the issue that we see in Venezuela with, forced food scarcity that has happened because of sanctions. And on top of that, they've also, they created school gardens. So one of the big issues in Nicaragua, and continues to be a huge issue, is malnutrition. And it's because most of our countries have been developed as monocultures, right? We grow banana, we grow plantain, we grow bean, we grow coffee. And these monocultures have created a really, how to explain it? Like a diet that's subsistence of like very basic staples. So what they've begun to do is create these school gardens to diversify the kinds of foods that people are eating in Nicaragua and the kinds of foods that they're familiar with, but also teaching them skills at the same time. So not only is it decolonizing, but it's also contributing to, development of skills, practical skills that people can use later in life to feed themselves, to feed their families. And literacy, they have one of the highest literacy rates for young people. It's like around 90%. And for women, it's almost full literacy, which I think is really cool. For some reason, men have a slightly lower literacy rate in Nicaragua. I don't know why that is, but
that's interesting.
They also have, relaunched the program Yo Si Puedo, or Si Puedo, right? The really well-known Cuban popular education literacy program that, they also used in Bolivia, Venezuela, and also has been one of the great cultural exports of Cuba, along with doctors. It has been these amazing education programs.
The literacy brigades and stuff,
that they bring to the rest of the world, not just Latin America. And they have a tried and true program that has been used in many countries for free of charge or in exchange for other things, and that's one of the most important and awesome solidarity, that Cuba does with Nicaragua. Oh, and on safety, we already mentioned some of this, but if you look at a map of, and this is in the article that Ramiro wrote, of the drug routes from the top of South America to Central America, you see a mass of flight plans all dropping in Honduras, or El Salvador, or Guatemala, and there's literally a big hole that is Nicaragua.
It goes right around it.
It goes right around it.
And it's interesting because there was a dispute a few years back. So the former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, who's a right-wing piece of shit reactionary, and he tried to start a dispute with Ortega about this island called San Andres.
Oh, right.
Which is basically, it's in the Caribbean, but it's a disputed island between Nicaragua. Historically, it was part of Nicaragua, but the Colombian government claims it. And the reason they were fighting over the island is because it's right exactly where a lot, like the drug trade route passes through. And so that island, there are a lot of shell companies that operate as like drug fronts. And so the Sandinistas were trying to crack down on drug dealers from that island who would fly planes from Colombia to San Andres to Honduras, and then from there up through Mexico to the US. And so, you know, that's an example of how they've been actively fighting against drug trafficking industry and have been improving conditions for people. And it's like, from a Western, like it's funny because when I was first learning about leftism and I was meeting so-called leftists in the US, it was all people who would say stuff like, oh, you know, we're pro-drugs and against governments that are like religious. And it kind of was this kind of like ultra-left critique of social democratic governments in Latin America that were fighting drug trafficking and were religious. But at the end of the day, like Ofelia was saying, building socialism is not about everything. When you're building socialism, when you're running an economy, a nation, the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis may not be the sexiest things, you know, building roads, building schools, but that stuff is so important because of the context of the country, of the region. These are things that people didn't have before. People didn't have cement roads, paved roads. People didn't have electricity,
housing,
right? And so,
healthcare.
Within the context of the history of Nicaragua, you know, doing these things to a Western leftist audience that for them, they just want to like burn shit down. Like, yeah, let's burn shit. Cool. Like, I support that too. But what are you going to build in its place, right? What are you going to build? And it goes back to kind of like what Ofelia was saying about, you know, with socialism and being Leninist and being communist, is that building socialism is about construction. And that's exactly what the Sandinistas are doing. Yeah, it looks a little different from what we've been told is the only and correct way that happened, for example, the Soviet Union or China. They're doing it their own way. And they're obviously successful given all of the stats that Ofelia was just citing.
And just because, you know, they're social democratic now doesn't mean that they'll never move more left, right? Like it's also, we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater and just be like, well, fuck social democracy and get rid of Ortega and the Sandinistas, right? Because that's the line a lot of people take. And we're like, no. No, they're like changing infant mortality rates. They're giving women access to, you know, healthcare, education, to political office. Like, they're doing so much. And I always say this to Ramiro, but to be social democratic in a third world country, it's 90% of the time is anti-imperialist.
Yeah, exactly.
It has to be. Right? There's no way you reappropriate natural resources in a third world country without pissing off the world hegemon, right? Or the European Union.
Exactly.
Because that's where they accumulate capital, right? Like off the backs of our people and off our countries. So when you have something like the Sandinistas coming forward and saying, actually, we're gonna use our money for ourselves.
We're keeping our shit.
And yeah, Venezuela, they're gonna give us oil and support us too. So fuck you guys. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, irrespective of whatever criticisms we have, because we have them. But I think that's really important to remember. And also, Nicaragua is very safe. Like, I think a report just came out this week on Monday from the UN, or God knows where the fuck where, but some, you know, institution that I have 10,000 criticisms of. But it has one of the lowest homicide rates in Latin America, which is really impressive. Yeah. Right, for such a small country, also. And it's insane because it neighbors Honduras. Yeah. Which has one of the highest.
It's day and night. It's day and night.
And it's like, what could be the difference? Oh my God. I wonder why. You know, and I'm just looking at people like, really? There's a reason, right? Because the people are in power. The people hold state power, and that's what happens. And on top of that, speaking on the anti-imperialism of Nicaragua, they're also allied with progressive and leftist states, right? So they have membership in ALBA, membership in CELAC, membership in the non-aligned movement, right? They're allied with Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba. They continue to work on projects with all of those countries. And I think that has allowed them.
Robert Diaz said, y'all finna organize over there? That's an interesting question. I mean, here's the thing. I feel like as communists in the first world in the US, it's not our place to say what road the people of Nicaragua should take. They're doing that now. You get what I'm saying? Our role is to be there to support them whatever way we can, to respond to their needs, to serve their needs. They know what they're doing. You know, they know. Look at that crowd. Like after this live, you know, they don't need shit to learn from us. Yeah, I could barely run my own life.
We could barely run this Facebook, this YouTube live. Much less run a country.
Exactly.
But I mean, obviously, this is part of our work, right? Like, you know, having these kind of YouTube lives, having Anticonquista as a platform, writing, speaking, disseminating as much information as we can, and obviously sending funds.
Yeah.
You know, because there is, you know, there's already the people holding state power in Nicaragua. We obviously don't send funds there. Right, we've recently sent funds to Haiti. We've recently sent funds to Puerto Rico, right? Because we, in our eyes, right, those seem to be like the most pertinent places for revolution, and where you know, some of our dollars could make a huge difference. And that's really how we see our role and what we do. But obviously, at any point, if they were like, "Yo, come down to Nicaragua and do some stuff," hell yeah, I'll be there tomorrow. But until that happens,
I'll be peeling potatoes or some shit on the back. Caleb Carmen was saying people who disown Venezuela and Nicaragua but sing praises of Nordic welfare states are revealing themselves as white supremacists.
Yes, I love that. Yeah,
deadass.
Absolutely. And especially here, people will say like, why can't? There's always a stupid fucking example. It's like, why can't the US be like Norway?
Right.
Why can't the US be like, I don't know, what's another one? Sweden. And why can't the US be like blah? I'm like, excuse me, not everyone can live like the fucking first world. If we all live like the first world, we'd need 5 planet Earths.
Yeah.
You know, what is gonna happen is that the Nordic states and the US have to, what's the word? Downscale from where they are currently, ourselves included.
Right.
You know, we're not an exemption to any of that. So if wealth redistribution, and when it happens, it has to happen. When it happens, it will be the first world giving back to the third world, not the other way around. It's not like the third world is suddenly everyone's going to be driving a fucking Toyota and, you know, have massive apartments. Like that's not feasible. And if you've been anywhere outside of the US, anywhere outside of Western Europe, you'll see that, right? Like when you're in Latin America, when you're in Africa, when you're in Asia, the quality of things is just different. It's not worse. It's just different.
Yeah.
And that's what would have to happen in the US. In the first world. For sure. And it says,
Caleb got some good comments, man. Your shit's on point, man. Caleb.
Carmen, the second Caleb.
Yeah, it's like Caleb number 2.
Social democracy is only authoritarian if it's in the global south, apparently. Yeah, that's a big one. And, you know, I think some of, and there's so many other facts on Nicaragua. That's just like scratching the surface of all the things that the Sandinistas have done in 12 years. All right, in 12 years. Obviously, there's a lot of shit that they need to improve on. There's still like, you know, a lot of deficiencies in diets, like we explained, because of these monocultures and the stifling of like the development of diverse foods, or rather the stripping of the development of our diverse foods, because we had diverse food systems right before fucking colonialism. And then colonialism comes in, all of a sudden, our land is just good for plantain, or our land is just good for coffee, and our land is just good for whatever like crop or good the first world needs to consume.
Yeah.
And that's most countries, right? To this day. But, you know, I think as always, we're reflective of where there needs to be some growth. And one of our biggest criticism, which we discussed already, is like the stunted progress on women's rights at times in Nicaragua, especially with abortion and reproductive rights. But there's people already there, fighting that fight. And I think it's something that needs to be worked on. And I think the religious elements in the country need to be worked on, especially this leniency with the Catholic Church, with the evangelicals, with the right-wing protesters. I mean, just today they released 50 of these fucking violent protesters with a new amnesty law. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, why? Why?
Yeah.
Why?
I don't think that was a good move.
I don't understand that, right? And they're playing a game, right? Like they're playing not a game, but they have to be strategic, right? It's a game of chess. You know, it's not like they could just do whatever they want.
Like, bam!
I mean, in our eyes,
problem solved.
Problem solved. But, you know, there doesn't look like they're going to, you know, they do also collaborate and recognize and work with Taiwan a lot. So that's one of our huge things. And obviously the limitations of social democracy will always be apparent. But that being said, I think from July 19th, 1979 to July 19th, 2019, Fonseca and Sandino would all be, you know, very proud of where Nicaragua is currently. And there's only more to come, honestly.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And the things they're doing, like, you know, they're building infrastructure, their economy is growing, they're empowering workers and people. And notice that, like Ofelia mentioned earlier, none of the people at the border right now who are coming up are coming from Nicaragua. And
I love that the articles on the migrant caravan will randomly throw in Nicaragua. Yeah. And I'm like,
it's like,
where?
No.
Where? Like 95% of those people are Honduran.
Right, exactly.
So
anyone have questions before
or comments or anything like that? I think we're gonna wrap up. We've been on here like an hour and a half. It's not what we
thanks to everyone for getting on. This is our as we said, our first live Anti-Conquista. We are a anti-imperialist media collective, and we create content produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora, speaking for ourselves as Latin American and Caribbean people. Me and Ofelia always joke that there's all these like white liberal experts in Latin America and the Caribbean who...
And as both of us who have worked for Latin American news organizations, research organizations, and have seen things from the inside, we won't mention any of them because that's petty and it's pointless. But, oh my Lord, the amount of times I had to be told by some fucking white Usonian who taught English in Honduras for a year that they knew more about Honduras than we did. And it's not about identity politics, no, but it's about the legitimacy that white bodies carry, in Latin America and the Caribbean versus Latin American people.
Exactly.
So I think, you know, they didn't see us as objective. They said, oh,
you're too emotional.
You're too emotional about it. Your emotions are in it. I'm like, I'm sorry if I'm fucking enraged by the oppression.
You're governed by caprice. Keep up the good work, comrade. Yo, good looks, whistleblower with a Canadian hammer and sickle.
Don't delete the video. We're not deleting it. I think
we'll leave it up.
We'll leave it up. Yeah. You can definitely.
We'll start streaming more. This is our first stream. And it's kind of more casual and chill.
How big is Anti-Conquista? We're about 10-ish.
Yeah, but as Anti-Conquista, we're also right now we're focused on. We're not so much focused on numbers per se as members. What we're trying to do our focus right now is two things. Right, number one is exposing imperialist media every day because we're competing against. Look, we got Univision, Telemundo, Azteca, Televisa, CNN. Venevisión, CNN Español, all these,
and even on top of that, the traditional conservative media that covers Latin America and the Caribbean, we're also contesting fucking Jacobin and
they're fucking trash.
You know what I mean? Like the kind
that conference, you remember?
We're also combating like the quote unquote progressive alternative media sites. In the US, because there really isn't anything defending or supporting Latin American Caribbean and the Caribbean from Latin America and the Caribbean within the US, right? Obviously, like when you look at Telesur or when you look at, you know, Hispan TV, when you look at other projects in Latin America, they have a great line. But I'm talking about like within the US and within English media.
Like Hot Cheetos.
There's very little. And we carry very little legitimacy. And on top of that, we're communists. So they're just like, they're fucking crazy.
But the thing too with us is like, we're being straight up with y'all. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're not, like, first of all, we don't get paid for this. That's number one. And that makes a difference because we could
before we close, please send donations to Anti-Conquista on PayPal. And Jacobin literally has nothing positive to say about Nicaragua.
Bro.
Not just Nicaragua. Everything.
Fucking.
And they wrote a big piece on Venezuela, I remember, a year ago, talking about the failures of Maduro, and it was completely infuriating.
Some dude drinking a soy latte at Starbucks in fucking Manhattan.
Who the fuck are you?
Right. Who the fuck asked you, bro? Like,
it's
But yeah, that's what we're trying to do. And go to what is it, Patreon or PayPal?
PayPal
me.
Anyway, we have links for the Patreon on the YouTube.
It's in the description on the YouTube.
On our description. So none of the funds go to us. We're not we're not like other organizations that print flyers, and we literally don't keep any of the money for ourselves. With the exception of our WordPress, we're very open and transparent about our funds. We'll tell anyone about our funding and how much money we've sent, how much money we've made, all of that stuff. Like, we don't do that, you know? We currently have jobs, both of us. We got to live, we got to eat.
But it's like,
but all the funds we have, like we said, we sent recently some money to Puerto Rico, to MEAN. We sent some money to Haiti, to the Haiti Solidarity.
Haiti Emergency Relief Fund. Haiti Action Committee.
The Haiti Action Committee. So we send anything we have in excess of whatever the website administrative costs are.
Our surplus value. If you want to be nerdy as fuck about it.
I mean, we're not capitalists, so.
But like, it's like, you know, we're trying to be real with you. We're trying to create revolutionary communist media that's actually us, that is not white people speaking for us. It's young Latinos who are doing our own stuff, and that's not just dumbed down, you know, hot Cheeto ideas for quinceañeras, you know, remezcla shit. You know what I'm saying? Because those are the kind of two extremes that Ofelia was just talking about. It's like this bourgeois CNN, you know, Univision, Telemundo, that are like poisoning the minds of our parents. Tell your parents, by the way, if y'all have, you know, parents who are immigrants like ours, like, turn off that shit is so bad for you.
We also have stuff in Spanish.
Yeah.
We have tons of stuff in Spanish on the website. We should do more videos in Spanish, but we'll work up to it. We both have full-time jobs while doing stuff for Anti-Conquista, and all of our other co-editors also. Yeah. We all have jobs. You know, so but this has been our priority for 2 years now, right? We've worked really hard.
Yeah, and we're gonna keep building it.
Hey Brian, we're actually in LA. Yeah, so
Latin America.
Also,
yeah, stolen
land.
Yeah.
I'm from East LA, Mexican.
Yeah, my family's from Honduras.
Honduran.
I was born and raised in New York. Kevin said, I'm thinking about starting a book club on revolutionary literature to establish a revolutionary political baseline in the African community. Oh, that's sick. That's
Kevin, you should check out Black Hammer.
Yeah, Black Hammer.
Which is also a site you might have heard of already, run by a great comrade, Ghazi.
Yeah.
Who's just great. He also has a lot of political commentary on his page, and they have a book club actually.
Yeah.
Maybe you could get some tips from them or something, but I think that's a great idea.
And let us know if y'all have things like maybe in the comment section of other streams you'd like to see us do. We want to try to do more and make them more conversational and chill, because we need to be talking, all of us here, we need to be talking to each other, because there's no other avenue like this out there, where as Latin American and Caribbean communists in the diaspora, we can have these kind of conversations that are not basic as fuck, but also not reactionary as fuck, like Univision.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Again, Feliz 19 de Julio. Today, not only the founding of the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, but also the triumph of the Sandinistas de Managua in 1979, and a recap of, you know, all the amazing things the Sandinistas and our people have been able to do in, you know, 12, 13 years since taking state power in 2006. So It's a great day. It's a great day to celebrate. It's a great day to share these accomplishments with everyone you know. And we're just a few days away from 26 de Julio, which, as we know, also a lit-ass day for Latin America and the Caribbean. Yeah,
and also we got July 26th coming up too, the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, the Movimiento 26 de Julio. So, you know, shout out to Cuba. Saludos a todos en Nicaragua. Si nos están escuchando en Nicaragua, saludos. Viva Sandino, viva el Frente, viva Daniel. Daniel se queda, aunque le duele. But thank you all for getting on. We really appreciate it. And
we'll try and do it live in Spanish at some point.
My Spanish, her Spanish is a little better than mine. My Spanish is busted as fuck. But who gives a fuck? At the end of the day, what matters is that we're getting this message out there, right? What matters is that our people are learning this, because they're not going to get this anywhere else.
And if you want to join us for a live, if you want to join us for an IG, if you want to join us for anything, we're always looking for contributors.
Yeah.
Obviously, because of our position, we believe that, you know, Latin American people are at the center, right, of the of our media collective. Like, we make the executive decisions, but obviously, like, if you want to contribute or do a type of chat, whatever, a collaboration with us, we're like totally open to that. So any compañeros en Latinoamérica, you know, que quieren hacer un live con nosotros, o una conversación, o un artículo, cualquier cosa, nos pueden mandar un mensaje. También nosotros podemos colaborar, hacer algo por Skype o por Facebook, lo que sea, para coordinar y tener conversaciones sobre lo que está ocurriendo en sus países. Obviously, like, we can't be up on everything, but we're more than open to having conversations with other folks, featuring stuff on Anticonquista, and obviously, like, this is more than us. This is more than us. So, es más que yo y Ramiro. Entonces, por favor, si nos quieren mandar un correo electrónico, un mensaje aquí por YouTube, o más bien por Facebook, siempre estamos chequeando los mensajes en Facebook, revisando esos mensajes. Entonces nos pueden mandar un mensaje, cualquier cosa. And yeah, thank you.
Peace out, y'all. Viva Nicaragua Libre, Sandinista. Viva Sandino, viva Daniel. Have a great night, everyone. Have a good weekend.